The label on the rack said Mark I trainer, suitable for new recruits. Recoil Class Minimal. It was bolted to a weapon that could punch through a warship's hull plating from 4 kilometers out. Nobody on that range had ever fired it standing up, let alone with one hand, and a human cadet was about to prove he could do both without so much as blinking. My name doesn't matter much in this account, but my rank does, because it's the reason I was standing in the observation gallery of Keshvantar Firing Range 7 that afternoon instead of somewhere more pleasant. I am, or was, Deputy Range Supervisor for the Coalition Joint Training Command, a title that sounds impressive until you understand that 90% of my job involved filling out incident reports for cadets who'd injured themselves showing off. I had seen every species in the Coalition fire, every weapon we owned. I had seen a Threll recruit dislocate both shoulders trying to overcompensate for a rifle's kick. I had seen a Wundry triplet unit synchronize their breathing so perfectly they fired as one mind and still missed the target by 2 full meters. Because confidence and competence are not the same thing, and most cadets confuse them constantly. I tell you this so you understand that I thought I had seen it all. I want to be honest with you, because if I'm not honest about how wrong I was, there's no point telling this story at all. The range itself sat carved into the belly of a repurposed asteroid, one of a dozen such facilities scattered along the training corridor between the Coalition's core worlds and the contested frontier. 7 kilometers of tunnel, reinforced with layered ceramic plating, humming with environmental systems that had to account for 6 different atmospheric preferences among the trainee population. Human recruits got a section with standard Sol normal air and gravity, because apparently that's what they were used to, though I'd later learn that word standard was doing a lot of quiet, dishonest work. The instructors that day were a mixed bag, which was typical. Master Instructor Dorn Kessick, a broad-shouldered Threll, with the kind of scarred hide that told you he'd survived things most recruits only heard about in briefings. Instructor Una Vale, a Coalition-born human liaison officer who'd been assigned to the Joint Program for Cross-Species Integration, and who I'd always found a little too quiet for my taste, like she knew something the rest of us didn't and had decided it wasn't worth the argument to share it. And 2 junior instructors, a pair of Ossarin twins named Kat and Fen, whose species reads emotion through skin pigment shifts, which meant everyone in that gallery would soon be treated to a live, involuntary color commentary on their own disbelief. We were there for the quarterly proficiency assessment, new batch of cadets, mixed species, first live fire qualification. Standard procedure was simple. Line them up, hand them the designated starter weapon, walk them through the basics, let them put a few rounds down range, grade their form. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that should have ended with 4 veteran gunnery instructors standing in dead silence while I quietly requested a classified personnel file on a 19-year-old human recruit. But we get ahead of ourselves. Let me back up, because context matters here, and if you don't understand what the Mark I trainer actually was, you won't understand why what happened next broke several of my colleagues' understanding of physics. The Coalition designates its firing range equipment using a numbering system that, on paper, makes perfect sense. Lower numbers for lighter, safer, entry-level equipment. Higher numbers for heavier ordnance, restricted to advanced certification only. It's a sensible system. It has worked without incident for the better part of 40 years across 17 member species. Which is exactly why nobody thought to double-check the labels when Range 7 got its equipment reshuffled during a facility-wide inventory audit 6 months prior. Here is what actually happened as I pieced it together afterward from logs, and let me tell you, piecing it together took a lot longer than it should have, because everyone involved was too embarrassed to admit their part in it. During that inventory audit, a batch of decommissioned anti-armor cannons, the kind used for heavy vehicle and light starship point defense penetration testing, had been pulled from Range 11, which was being converted into a simulation-only facility. These cannons were meant to be shipped to storage pending decommissioning. Someone, and to this day, nobody has taken formal ownership of this decision, misfiled the transfer paperwork. The cannons ended up in Range 7's equipment vault. And in a truly spectacular act of bureaucratic negligence, the requisition tags identifying them as heavy anti-armor ordnance got swapped, digitally and physically, with the tags for an entirely different, entirely unrelated shipment of actual trainer rifles that were headed somewhere else. So, for 6 months, Range 7's official inventory system listed 4 Kasari Pattern Type 9 anti-armor cannons, weapons designed to be mounted on tripods or vehicle chassis, weapons that in standard operation require a hydraulic recoil dampening rig just to keep from breaking the wrist of anyone attempting to fire them handheld as Mark I trainers. Beginner rifles, suitable for new recruits. Nobody caught it. Why would they? Nobody had actually needed to use the starter weapons in that particular rack for 6 months because the last several cadet cohorts through Range 7 had been advanced transfers who skipped the beginner stage entirely. The cannons sat there, mislabeled, gathering a fine patina of range dust, looking for all the world like slightly oversized rifles if you squinted and didn't know any better. Which brings us to the cadet. His name was Elias Reyes. 19 years old, standard Earth reckoning, which the file would later tell me was actually quite young for a coalition recruit given human lifespans, though at the time none of us thought much about it. He'd come up through the joint training pipeline after transferring from what his enlistment record blandly described as Regional Militia Service, Planetary Defense Auxiliary, Sol Colony, Designates 7. I want you to remember that phrase, because it comes up again and it means something very different than it sounds like it means. Physically, he did not stand out. That's important to establish, because I know how these stories usually go in the retellings, and I know people want to imagine some hulking specimen striding onto the range like a monument to muscle. He wasn't that. He was maybe average height for a human male, lean rather than bulky. The kind of build you'd expect from someone who ran a lot, rather than someone who lifted heavy things for fun. Quiet. Polite in that clipped, economical, human way. He'd said maybe 6 words to anyone that morning. Mostly things like, yes, sir, and understood, and, memorably, which line? Instructor Keswick, who ran the equipment distribution for the day, had exactly 0 reason to expect anything unusual from him. Keswick called out names off his roster. Cadets stepped forward, got handed their designated starter weapon, moved to their assigned lane, standard procedure, repeated a few dozen times that morning, without incident. When Reyes stepped up, Keswick reached into the rack, grabbed what the manifest told him was Trainer Unit 4, and held it out. I was watching from the gallery through the reinforced viewport, more out of habit than genuine attention. Honestly, half paying attention to a data pad with a supply requisition I needed to approve. I remember glancing up mostly because Keswick paused for half a second longer than usual, which for a thrall whose species processes visual information almost twice as fast as a human's, meant something had briefly registered as strange to him before his brain filed it away as unimportant. In hindsight, I think some instinctive part of him clocked the actual mass of that weapon as he lifted it off the rack, some proprioceptive alarm bell that got immediately overridden by the manifest tag that clearly, confidently, in bold coalition standard script, read Mark I Trainer. He handed it to Reyes. Now, understand the physical comedy that should have happened here because it's important for what comes after. The Kasari pattern Type 9 anti-armor cannon, even in its lightest configuration, masses somewhere around 41 kilograms unloaded. Loaded, with a full magazine of its specialized armor-penetrating rounds, you're looking at closer to 44. It is a weapon designed to be operated from a stabilized mount, or at absolute minimum braced against a shoulder rig with hydraulic assistance, by someone wearing powered exoskeletal support. It is not under any circumstances found in any coalition training manual I have ever read, a weapon meant to be held one-handed by an unassisted humanoid of any species we'd previously encountered, human or otherwise. I saw several of the instructors in the gallery with me, off-duty, that shift, glance over with the mild, lazy curiosity you'd expect from watching a mildly amusing accident about to happen. Someone, I think it was a Vandari logistics officer named Bresh, actually said, half joking, watch him drop it, because the assumption, the completely reasonable assumption based on every scrap of data any of us had about humans up to that point, was that Reyes was about to be handed a weapon that was, by mislabeled manifest error, roughly triple the mass of an actual beginner trainer, and that he would, at absolute best, stagger at worst, injure himself trying to hold it. Elias Reyes took the weapon from Keswick's outstretched hands. He held out one arm, and it just stopped. Hung there, level, steady, like it weighed nothing at all. I want to describe the silence that followed, because it wasn't really silence in the sense of an absence of sound. The range was still running its ambient systems, the hum of the ventilation, the distant clatter of other cadets in other lanes going through basic drills. But every conversation in that gallery just stopped mid-sentence. Bresh's mouth was still open around whatever joke he'd been about to finish. I watched Instructor Vale, the human liaison officer, go very, very still in a way that I didn't understand yet, but would come to recognize later as a specific and very human kind of stillness, the kind that means someone has recognized something and is choosing very deliberately not to react to it yet. Keswick, to his credit, was the first of the instructors to actually register that something was deeply wrong. I watched him look down at the requisition tag still clipped to the weapon's stock, then look at Reyes's arm, perfectly level, not trembling, not straining, and I watched something in his scarred thrill face do a slow, dawning recalculation. "Cadet," Keswick said, and his voice had gone very carefully neutral, in the way that experienced instructors get when they suspect they've made a mistake and are trying to figure out how bad it is before anyone else notices. "Report your grip. Standard two-handed brace positioning, please." Reyes looked down at the weapon in his one hand, then back up at Keswick, and here is the first piece of dialogue I have on record from that day. Because Vale had her sidearm's built-in recorder running for the assessment log, standard procedure, and I've listened to this exchange more times than I probably should admit. "Sir," Reyes said, "is this the trainer rifle?" "That's correct, Cadet. It's heavier than the specs I studied. Recoil Class Minimal, 5 kilograms unloaded, is what the manual says." A pause. "This isn't 5 kilograms. Now I want you to sit with that for a second, because that's the detail that should tell you everything about who Elias Reyes actually was, long before anyone in that room understood the full shape of it. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't struggling. He'd noticed, immediately and precisely, that the weight didn't match the documentation, and his first instinct was an alarm. It was a calm, procedural flag, like a mechanic noticing a part was the wrong gauge. He wasn't showing off. He genuinely, in that moment, thought he was being handed defective or mislabeled equipment, and his response to holding what felt to him like a somewhat heavier than expected trainer rifle was to mention it politely, the way you'd mention a typo in a manual. Keswick took the weapon back from him, at which point every single one of us in that gallery got to watch a 210-kilogram Threll master instructor, a being whose species is renowned across the coalition for raw physical power, need both arms and a visibly engaged core stance to keep the weapon from dipping when he took it in the standard two-handed grip. That's when the tags got checked. That's when the manifest got pulled up on a data slate right there on the range floor. That's when Keswick, staring at a screen that clearly read Kasari Pattern Type 9 Anti-Armor Restricted Certification Level 5, made a sound that I have never heard a Threll make before or since, a kind of low guttural exhale that I can only describe as the noise a very large, very tough being makes when it realizes it has just been standing 3 meters away from a live anti-armor round for the better part of 10 minutes without any of the appropriate safety protocols in place. Range control called an immediate halt. All lanes, weapons down, hands visible, standard lockdown procedure for equipment malfunction or safety violation. Klaxons, the whole procedure. Cadets in the other lanes, most of whom had no idea what had just happened, were escorted out in orderly confusion, muttering to each other about pop quizzes and surprise drills. Reyes just stood there, weapon lowered per instruction, looking politely bewildered, the way you'd look if the fire alarm went off during a fairly boring lecture and you weren't sure whether to be worried or annoyed. Deadus. I came down from the gallery myself at that point because a Class 5 safety incident, even a resolved one, requires supervisor sign-off. And frankly, because I wanted to see this with my own eyes rather than through reinforced viewport glass and second-hand shock. By the time I reached the range floor, Keswick had the weapon secured, unloaded, and was in the process of very carefully not looking anyone in the eye, which for a species whose culture places enormous weight on accountability and directness, told me exactly how badly he felt about having handed a live anti-armor cannon to a teenager, under the impression it was a starter rifle. The Osarin twins, Ket and Fen, had gone through what I can only describe as an entire spectrum of skin color panic, cycling from their normal pale blue-gray through a shocked yellow-white and settling into a deep, mortified violet that in their culture roughly translates to profound professional embarrassment. An instructor Vale, the human liaison, was standing very close to Reyes, arms crossed, studying him with an expression I still can't fully describe except to say that it looked less like shock and more like recognition. Like she was looking at a word she already knew the meaning of, finding it written somewhere. She hadn't expected to see it. "Cadet Reyes," I said, because someone needed to establish some order, and apparently that job had fallen to me. "Can you tell me, in your own words, what just happened?" He straightened up, the clean, economical posture that I'd later learn was drilled into him somewhere long before he ever set foot in a coalition facility. "Sir, I was issued a weapon labeled as a standard trainer rifle. It felt heavier than the specifications indicated. I reported the discrepancy to Instructor Kessick. That's the full extent of my knowledge, sir." "You held a 44-kilogram anti-armor cannon extended at arm's length, one-handed, without visible strain," I said, mostly because I needed to hear myself say it out loud to believe it had actually happened. "Does that strike you as unusual?" There was a pause. And here's the thing about that pause that I want you to understand, because it's the moment that actually started unraveling everything, for me, more than the weapon itself. He looked genuinely puzzled by the question, not evasive, not falsely modest. Actually, sincerely puzzled, like I'd asked him whether he found it unusual that water was wet. "Sir, respectfully, I don't have much to compare it to. It felt like a solid rifle, heavier than advertised but manageable." Another beat. "Is 44 kilograms considered a lot?" I remember looking at Kessick at that point, and Kessick looking back at me, and neither of us having a single useful thing to say. Because how do you answer that question, honestly, without unraveling several assumptions that the entire coalition training apparatus had been operating under since the joint program with humanity began? Because here's what you need to understand, and here's what none of us in that room fully appreciated. Yet, the coalition's initial assessment of humanity, formed during the brief window of first contact and early diplomatic exchange, had been built almost entirely on baseline physiological data. Human bone density, human muscle fiber composition, human cardiovascular output, all measured, cataloged, and compared against coalition norms established by species like the Threll, the Wunderi, and half a dozen others who'd been fighting wars and building empires among the stars for centuries longer than humanity had even had electricity. By those baseline numbers, humans looked, frankly, unimpressive. Middling bone density. Unremarkable grip strength compared to a Threll. No natural armor, no claws, no venom, no bioelectric weaponry, nothing that jumped off the page in a species assessment file. The Coalition's threat classification system, which ranks newly contacted species on a scale of 1 to 10 for combat and physical capability, had rated humanity a 3. Somewhere in the range of generally harmless exercise standard caution, alongside several species primarily known for agriculture and diplomacy. What that assessment failed to account for, and this is the part that took me weeks of digging afterward to fully understand, was where those baseline numbers had actually come from. They'd come from population averages, office workers, students, the broad statistical middle of a species spread across dozens of colonies with wildly different environmental conditions. Nobody had thought to separately flag what happened to a human raised somewhere like Sol Colony Designate 7. I need to explain what that designation actually meant, because it's the piece of the puzzle that changed everything I thought I understood about the kid standing in front of me holding an anti-armor cannon like it was a broom handle. Sol Colony Designate 7, according to the file. I eventually pulled, and believe me, Pulling it required going several levels above my normal clearance and calling in a favor from someone in Coalition records who owed me for an incident report I'd quietly buried 2 years earlier. Was not a garden colony. It wasn't one of the pleasant, terraformed worlds that most Coalition citizens pictured when they thought of human settlements. It was a mining and heavy industry outpost, established on a moon with 1.8 times standard gravity, orbiting a gas giant in a system with almost no natural magnetosphere protection, meaning the colony existed under a permanent dome with radiation storms that could knock out surface equipment for days at a time, and an atmosphere outside the dome that would kill an unprotected human in under 90 seconds. The colony had been established, according to the historical notes in the file, by a mixture of asteroid mining conglomerates and this detail made my blood run a little cold when I read it, a resettled population of refugees from an Earth region that had been rendered largely uninhabitable by what the file blandly described as the third resource conflict. Elias Reyes had been born on that moon, raised in 1.8 gravity from birth. His childhood, according to a supplementary psychological evaluation that had apparently been standard intake procedure and that nobody had ever flagged for special review. Because again, the Coalition's threat assessment for humans as a species was a 3D involved things like mandatory manual labor shifts starting at age 12 in the colony's ore processing facilities, militia drills against periodic raids from unaffiliated salvage pirates who preyed on remote mining colonies, and what one evaluators note dryly referred to as a culturally normalized relationship with physical risk that would be considered pathological in a core world population. In other words, and I want to say this as plainly as I can because I think it's the actual heart of this story, Elias Reyes had spent his entire developmental life in conditions that would have killed or crippled most Coalition species outright, under gravity that was nearly double what most of us in that room had ever trained under. Doing manual industrial labor from an age when most Coalition children are still in primary schooling, occasionally being shot at by pirates, and the Coalition's grand, sweeping classification system had looked at all of that and filed him under the same broad species-wide threat rating of 3 that applied to a human accountant living comfortably on a Bray core world station who had never lifted anything heavier than a briefcase. The starter rifle mislabeling was an accident, a genuine, embarrassing paperwork-level accident that had nothing to do with any grand design. But the reason it didn't matter, the reason it revealed something true instead of just being a funny story about clerical error, was Elias Reyes. I didn't know any of this yet, standing on that range floor. All I knew was that I had a safety incident to document, 4 instructors in various states of professional crisis, and a cadet who was looking at me like he genuinely wanted to know if 44 kilograms was a lot, because he didn't have a reliable frame of reference for what counted as heavy. "Cadet," I said slowly, "I want you to demonstrate something for me, under supervision, with the weapon confirmed, empty and range-safe." Keswick shot me a look that I understood immediately, because he was thinking exactly what I was thinking, which was that we had already had one Class 5 incident that morning, and did we really want to manufacture the conditions for a second one? But I'd already made the call, mostly because I'd been doing this job for 11 years and I had never, not once, seen anything like what I'd just witnessed, and some part of me needed to understand if it had been a fluke, an adrenaline spike, some strange one-time confluence of circumstance, or if it was simply, boringly, what this particular human could actually do. Two-handed brace, extended hold, level aim, downrange, empty chamber, safety confirmed, I said. Just hold the position. Nothing else. Reyes nodded, took the weapon back from Keswick, who handed it over with the careful, deliberate movements of someone passing a live grenade to a toddler, and settled into a firing stance. I want to describe what I saw, because I've thought about how to explain this to people who weren't there. And the closest comparison I've come up with is this. Imagine watching someone pick up what looks like a fairly ordinary object and having every visual and instinctive cue in your body tell you that object should be heavy, should require visible effort, should produce some strain in the shoulders, some tremor in the extended arms after even 30 seconds, and instead watching a body simply refuse to acknowledge any of that. He held it level for 2 minutes. Then, 3. Keswick, watching a chronometer with an expression that had graduated from professional concern into something closer to religious awe, called out the time at each interval. 4 minutes. The weapon didn't waver by more than what our sensors would later measure as a few millimeters, well within what you'd expect from someone holding a completely unloaded, featherlight training prop, not a 44-kilogram anti-armor cannon. "That's enough, Cadet. You can lower it," I said, mostly because I wasn't sure how much longer my own composure was going to hold out, and I needed a moment to think. He lowered the weapon, handed it back to Keswick, with a small, apologetic sort of shrug, as though he suspected he'd done something wrong, and wanted to preemptively signal he hadn't meant to cause trouble. "Sir, permission to ask a question," he said. "Granted. Did I fail the assessment somehow? I wasn't sure what the correct response was supposed to be." I actually laughed at that. I couldn't help it. It came out sharper and more disbelieving than I intended, and I saw Reyes's expression flicker with the particular discomfort of someone who suspects they're the butt of a joke they don't understand. "No, Cadet," I said once I'd gotten myself back under control. "You didn't fail anything. Go with Instructor Vale. She's going to get you settled somewhere comfortable while the rest of us figure out what just happened." That's the part of the story where I want to shift focus for a moment away from the range floor and toward the aftermath. Because the aftermath is where the real reckoning happened, not just for Reyes, but for the entire training command structure that had let a threat classification of 3 stand unquestioned for as long as it had. I convened an emergency briefing that afternoon myself, Keswick, Vale, the Ossarin twins, and once I'd made the necessary calls up the chain, a representative from Coalition Records named Director Ashen Peel, a severe, methodical Vandari administrator, whose entire professional reputation was built on the idea that the classification system was thorough, rigorous, and essentially infallible. I watched that reputation take a visible dent over the course of about 40 minutes. The Type 9 cannon's operational specifications require a minimum of hydraulic assist or exoskeletal support for handheld operation, Director Peel said, reading from a data slate with the flat, careful tone of someone hoping that repeating the specifications enough times might make reality rearrange itself to fit them. "Unassisted operation by any known coalition species is rated as," and I quote the manual directly here, "not physically achievable outside of extreme statistical outliers." "Well," Keswick said, in the dry, understated way that Threll deploys sarcasm when they're too emotionally exhausted to be properly formal about it, "I suppose we've found your outlier." "One outlier does not require a full reclassification," Peel said, though I noted he didn't say it with much conviction. This is where Instructor Vale finally spoke up, and I want to give her words fully because she'd been quiet through most of the briefing in that watchful way I'd noticed earlier. And when she did speak, the room actually went quiet to listen, which for a briefing with a Vandari director present was not a small thing. "With respect, Director, I don't think you understand what you're looking at," Vale said. "I grew up on Earth core continent, moderate colony conditions, nothing extreme. And even I could tell you that this isn't some freak genetic anomaly you're dealing with. This is what happens when you take a species that's already built for a brutal homeworld and then raise a member of it somewhere even harder than that." "Explain," Peel said, and to his credit, he said it like he actually wanted to understand, rather than like he was humoring her. "Earth's gravity is nothing special compared to a lot of colony worlds." "Sure," Vale said. "But Earth spent a few 100,000 years grinding humans through predator pressure, disease, climate extremes, and each other before we even got off the surface. We don't have claws or venom or armor plating because we never needed them. We out-adapted everything that could have killed us using brains, cooperation, and sheer bloody-minded persistence. And then, when we started colonizing, we didn't get to pick the nice worlds first. The nice worlds were expensive and contested. The desperate colonies, the resource conflict refugee resettlements, those went to the moons and asteroids, and gas giant orbits nobody else wanted. Sol Colony, Designate 7, isn't an anomaly in human history, Director. It's a pattern. We've been doing this to ourselves for our entire existence as a species, one way or another. This cadet just happens to be a particularly clean data point." There was a silence after that, the kind of silence where you can feel an entire institutional worldview quietly repositioning itself. You're saying, Peel said slowly, that our threat classification system has been averaging out a species whose developmental extremes can vary this dramatically and treating the result as a stable baseline. I'm saying, Vale said, that you rated a species a 3 because you measured the middle of the bell curve and ignored the tail. And the tail, in this case, just held a 44-kilogram cannon at arm's length for 4 minutes, without breaking a sweat, and genuinely wanted to know if that was considered impressive. I remember Peel sat with that for a long moment and then did something I respected him for, which was that he didn't argue. He pulled up a fresh document on his data slate and started drafting what would eventually become a formal request for full reclassification review, a process that, as I'd later learn, hadn't been seriously initiated for humanity in the 11 years since first contact. But that briefing wasn't really the emotional center of the day. That came later. That evening, after the incident reports had been filed, after the equipment vault had been re-inventoried at gunpoint speed by a very motivated logistics team eager to make sure nothing else was mislabeled. Prank. After most of the facility had settled back into its normal rhythm with the specific electric hum of a place that knows something extraordinary happened and hasn't finished talking about it yet, I found Reyes in the mess hall alone at a corner table, working through a tray of the bland, calorically dense nutrient paste that passed for food in most coalition training facilities, looking for all the world like nothing unusual had happened to him that day at all. I sat down across from him without asking, which was a minor breach of the informal hierarchy, but felt appropriate given the day we'd had. "Cadet," I said, "mind if I ask you something off the record?" He looked up, chewing, swallowed, and nodded. "Sir, your file mentions Sol Colony, designate 7. I did some reading. This afternoon, 1.8 gravity radiation storms. Mandatory labor shifts, starting at 12. Pirate raids." I paused. That's not really what I pictured when I thought about human home life. Something shifted in his face then, not quite pain, not quite defensiveness, more like the careful, weary patience of someone who's had to explain this before and has learned to do it without much emotion, because emotion doesn't help anyone process or faster or survive a raid better. "It's what I know, sir," he said. "Didn't seem unusual growing up. Everybody I knew did the same shifts, dealt with the same gravity, ran the same drills." He set down his utensil. "First time I left the colony was to enlist. Took me a solid 2 weeks after I got to core world gravity before I stopped feeling like I was floating every time I walked. Everything here feels," he searched for the word, "loose, easy. Sir, no offense, but most of the exercises in the physical training curriculum here feel like a rest day back home." "You held an anti-armor cannon at arm's length for 4 minutes, I said. "That's not a rest day for anyone. Cadet, that's not a rest day for a thrill." He shrugged, an oddly boyish gesture that clashed strangely with everything else I now knew about him. "Compared to hauling raw ore crates in 1.8 gravity for a 10-hour shift, sir, honestly, 4 minutes of holding something steady isn't much." I sat with that for a while, watching him go back to his food with the same unbothered calm he'd shown on the range floor. "Can I ask you something else?" I said. "Why the militia service? Your enlistment record mentions Planetary Defense Auxiliary before you transferred to the Coalition program." He was quiet for a moment. "Pirates hit the colony 3 times growing up, sir. Salvage raiders mostly. Looking for processed ore, sometimes equipment, once looking for people to sell as labor contracts to less scrupulous outfits further out. First time I was 8. Hid in a maintenance duct for 6 hours with my little sister while the militia dealt with it." He said this in the same flat, factual tone he'd used to report a weapons weight discrepancy. "Second time, I was 13. That time, I didn't hide. Grabbed a maintenance pipe and went to help barricade the processing wing entrance. Third time I was 16, and by then I was already doing formal militia drills, so I actually had a rifle. A real one, standard colonial issue, not much lighter than that. Cannon today, honestly, because good equipment doesn't reach the frontier colonies easily, and you use what you can get." He looked at me then, and there was something quietly steady in his eyes that I hadn't fully registered until that moment. Something that had nothing to do with muscle mass or bone density or any of the numbers the Coalition liked to measure. "I didn't join the Coalition program because I wanted to be a soldier, sir," he said. I joined because Sol Colony Designate 7 doesn't have a lot of paths off the rock. The coalition program was one of maybe 3 ways I could get my little sister somewhere with a magnetosphere in a hospital that isn't a converted storage container. I'm good at this stuff because I had to be, not because I wanted a career out of it. I didn't have a response for that. I still don't know that I do, all these years later, except that it's the moment the whole day crystallized for me into something bigger than a funny anecdote about a mislabeled weapon. Word, of course, had already spread through the facility by dinner. That's the nature of any institution with more than about 6 people in it. Within hours, the story had passed through 3 separate rounds of exaggeration, and by the time I heard it secondhand from a cadet in an entirely different training track, the anti-armor cannon had apparently grown to twice its actual mass, and Reyes had allegedly done one-armed push-ups with it strapped to his back, which for the record he had not done, though I wouldn't have entirely put it past him at that point. The veteran gunnery instructors, the ones who'd been running that range for years, who'd trained hundreds of cadets across a dozen species, took it the hardest, in a professional sense. I want to be fair to them here, because their reaction wasn't petty or resentful, not mostly. It was something closer to a quiet, unsettled recalibration of things they thought they understood about their own field. Master Instructor Keswick, in particular, requested a private meeting with me 2 days later, and what he said stuck with me. "I've trained recruits for 26 years, he told me, sitting in my cramped office with his knees practically at his chest because Threll-scale furniture wasn't standard issue for administrative staff. I know weight, I know strain, I know what a body under load looks like, across a dozen species, in my sleep." I looked at that cadet holding that weapon, and my instincts told me nothing was wrong. Not that something impressive was happening. Nothing. My eyes told me he was holding a 5-kilogram rifle, exactly the way the manual says a 5-kilogram rifle should be held. There was no visible strain because, near as the medical team could measure afterward, there wasn't any. Not real strain. He was operating well within his own physical margins. He paused, and something in his scarred, weathered face looked almost troubled. "That's the part that unsettles me, Supervisor. It's not that he's strong. Plenty of things in this galaxy are strong. It's that he was calm about it. Completely, boringly calm. Like his body had never once in his entire life been asked to do something it considered a genuine challenge, and he had no internal reference point for what struggling would even feel like. I thought about that for a long time afterward. I still think about it now, because here's the thing about the Coalition's whole approach to threat assessment, something Vale had already started unpacking in that briefing, but which took me longer to fully absorb. We'd built our entire framework for understanding other species around, the idea that capability announces itself, that a dangerous being looks dangerous, moves like it's dangerous, telegraphs its power through visible strain, obvious musculature, some external signal that lets you calibrate your expectations accordingly. A Threll under heavy load grunts, braces, visibly commits its whole body to the effort, because that's simply how Threll physiology communicates exertion. Elias Reyes didn't have that tell. Not because he was hiding it, not through any deliberate act of concealment, but because there was genuinely nothing to hide. His baseline was simply that far removed from what the task demanded of him. He wasn't performing effortlessness. He was effortless, the way a person raised at sea level might not even register a gentle hill as an incline because their body has never needed to develop the vocabulary for that kind of strain. Director Peel's reclassification request, once submitted, kicked off a review process that I'm told secondhand took the better part of 8 months to fully resolve, involving multiple field studies. A genuinely uncomfortable number of formal apologies routed through diplomatic channels. And what I heard described by one exhausted records clerk as the single largest data collection exercise the department has run since the founding of the Coalition. Teams were dispatched to a sampling of human frontier colonies, Sol Colony Designate 7 among them, to properly measure what human capability actually meant when you stopped averaging it against a comfortable core world baseline and started accounting for the genuine range of environments humans had scattered themselves across. The findings, once compiled, made for what I understand was a fairly dramatic committee session. Humanity's threat classification was revised from a flat species-wide rating of 3 to what the new documentation called a variable band assessment, ranging from a 2 for humans raised in comfortable core world conditions with no combat or heavy labor exposure, all the way up to what I was told, though I never saw the exact classification number myself, since it required clearance above mine, was somewhere in the range typically reserved for species considered individually formidable regardless of technology, a rating that puts certain frontier-raised humans in the same rough tier as some of the Coalition's most physically dangerous known species. I want to be careful here not to overstate this into some triumphant, sweeping story about humanity being secretly the strongest species in the galaxy, because that's not really what this story is about, and I don't think it's what Elias Reyes would want people to take from it either. It's not really a story about strength at all, not fundamentally. It's a story about the gap between what a system expects and what individual lives actually contain, and about how easy it is for even a well-meaning, thorough institution to mistake an average for a truth. As for Reyes himself, I want to tell you what happened to him, because I did stay in occasional contact, mostly through the kind of professional courtesy that develops after you've been part of something strange enough together that it creates a small permanent bond. He finished the training program. Obviously, though, finished undersells it somewhat. Once the facility recalibrated its expectations, and once his actual file got properly flagged rather than buried under a generic species-wide rating, he ended up fast-tracked into a specialized program for personnel suited to extreme environment operations, the kind of postings that most cadets, human or otherwise, actively avoided because they involved deployments to conditions that would be, at minimum, deeply unpleasant for anyone not specifically built for them. Reyes, from what I understand, requested those postings specifically. I asked him about it once, in a message exchange a couple years after the incident, when he was stationed somewhere. I wasn't cleared to know the exact coordinates of doing work that his message described only as logistic support, difficult terrain. I asked him why he kept choosing the hard assignments when his new classification and reputation could have gotten him nearly any placement he wanted, somewhere comfortable, somewhere easy, somewhere that would have been, by his own account, an actual rest compared to what he grew up doing. His answer, and I've kept the message because I think it captures something true about him and maybe about what this whole story is actually pointing at, was this: "Sir, I appreciate the thought, but easy postings make me nervous. I don't know how to relax into comfortable. Feels like waiting for something bad to happen that you're not ready for. Difficult terrain, I know what to do with. Easy terrain, I just keep waiting for the floor to open up." I remember reading that and thinking about Sol Colony Designate 7, about a moon with almost no magnetosphere and gravity nearly double standard, about a 12-year-old working ore processing shifts, and an 8-year-old hiding in a maintenance duct with his little sister for 6 hours, something that no threat classification number could have ever properly captured. Elias Reyes wasn't strong because some quirk of biology had made him that way by accident. He was who he was because an entire childhood had asked more of him than most beings in the galaxy would ever be asked in a lifetime, and he had simply, quietly, without complaint or fanfare, met that demand every single time it was made, until meeting impossible demands had become the only mode he really knew how to operate in. The Kasari pattern Type 9 anti-armor cannon that started this whole mess, incidentally, got properly relabeled within about a week along with the rest of the mislabeled shipment, and a new redundant tagging protocol got implemented across every Coalition training facility to make sure heavy ordnance could never again masquerade as beginner equipment. I'm told that protocol is now referred to informally among the training staff who know the story as the Reyes Protocol, though I don't think Reyes himself ever found out that his name got attached to a filing procedure. And honestly, knowing him even a little, I suspect he'd have found the whole thing mildly embarrassing rather than flattering. I think about that afternoon on the range floor more often than I probably should, given how many years have passed since. I think about Bresh, half joking that we were about to watch him drop it. I think about Keswick's face when he finally read the manifest tag correctly. I think about the Osarin twins cycling through an entire spectrum of mortified color. I think about Director Peel, sitting there with his careful, methodical certainty, slowly dissolving into something more honest, more humble, more willing to admit that a system built to measure a whole galaxy of species had missed something important, because it had never bothered to ask what happens at the edges, in the hard places. To the people, nobody in a comfortable core world office ever really thought to look at closely. But mostly, if I'm honest, I think about Reyes himself, sitting in that mess hall, calmly explaining a childhood of raids and radiation storms and 12-hour labor shifts in the exact same flat, unbothered tone he'd used to report that a training rifle felt heavier than the specifications indicated. Not performing toughness, not asking for pity or admiration, just telling me, plainly, what his life had been, because I'd asked, and because in his world, that's simply what a life like his looked like. I don't know if there's a tidy lesson at the end of a story like this one. I've turned it over enough times that I'm not sure tidy lessons are really the point, but if I had to land on something, it would be this. Every species the Coalition has ever cataloged gets reduced, eventually to a number on a chart, a threat rating, a classification tier, a set of average statistics meant to let busy administrators make fast decisions about beings they'll likely never personally meet. And most of the time I imagine those numbers are close enough to true to be useful. But somewhere in every average, there's a tail end of the curve that the average doesn't capture. Somewhere in every species there are lives being lived at extremes nobody bothered to properly measure, shaped by conditions nobody comfortable ever has to imagine, producing people who walk quietly through the world carrying capabilities they don't even think to consider unusual, because unusual was simply the only version of normal they ever had. I gotta watch that truth walk into a firing range wearing a Coalition training uniform, hold a weapon meant to punch through starship hull plating steady in one hand for 4 uninterrupted minutes, and then apologize for possibly causing an inconvenience. I don't imagine I'll ever see anything quite like it again. But I'll tell you this much. Every single time a new cadet gets handed a weapon off that rack, now, somewhere in the back of every instructor's mind at range 7, there's a small, quiet voice that says, check the tag twice, and then, just to be safe, watch their arm. 'Cause you never really know, until the moment arrives, what kind of life is standing quietly in front of you, waiting to be underestimated one more time.